Hello and welcome back to Sig Mechanics. I'm Edmund. In this video, I'm going to show you step by step how I convert a non-manual safety FCU and grip module into a fully functional manual safety P320 that uses and accepts the factory manual safety lever kit from Sig Sauer. The process also works with the X10 model, as I have tested for that as well. To make the conversion, I'm using the MSAFE-T Toolkit for the X Series P320, which is now available if you visit www.sigmech.store. Now, I can't link to the website directly on this channel, but you can either look up sigmech.store, or over the next few months, you'll also start seeing this kit available through various retailers and other online stores. Now, back to the MSAFE-T kit. As you may know if you've watched the Sig Mechanics video I posted a few months back, this kit was specifically designed by me to correctly and consistently locate and then subsequently cut the precise design you need to let the factory manual safety lever kit operate as per factory specifications. And this kit was made to perfectly replicate and match the M17 and M18 P320 models. For example, if you install the kit onto either the M17 or M18 FCU frames, you will see that the toolkit and the FCU line up perfectly. The kit also includes for making the correct modifications to an X series grip and also to an X10 due to its design, but it isn't made for the standard grip module, although I am looking into releasing something for those very soon. Okay, so I'm going to try to break this video down into manageable sections so the chapters are easily searchable in the video description. And so you should be able to just skip ahead to any one part you are most interested in watching. And so the structure of this video, I'll try to keep like this. I'm going to start by introducing you to the MSAFE-T kit and explain which parts are included within the package. I'm then going to review what additional tools outside of the MSAFE-T kit you might want to have in order to complete this project successfully or just make your life easier. Following that, we're going to jump into the step-by-step installation process so you can see how to mount the toolkit correctly, and this will be further broken down into the FCU and grip module installs. Next, I will explain the step-by-step process of the cutting, which again, I will further break down into the FCU and grip module modifications. And finally, we'll end with showing you how to install the factory manual safety lever onto your newly modified P320. Okay, let's begin. Now, before we get into it, as usual, a quick disclaimer: I'm not a gunsmith or a certified armorer, and any modifications or work done to a firearm should be completed and inspected by a qualified gunsmith. If you do use the MSAFE-T toolkit, you are agreeing to take full responsibility for any and all legal, health, and warranty consequences that may be incurred. For example, modifying your FCU or even installing factory parts yourself will in most cases void Sig Sauer's factory warranty. Also, modifying your firearm may be prohibited in your state, so before proceeding, please make sure to check all local, state, and federal laws to make sure you are compliant. So here's the kit, and inside you're going to find almost all the tools needed to complete this project outside of actual hand tools. When you open the kit, the first thing you're going to want to check out is this card insert, and this has a QR code printed on the front, and scanning this code with your phone will direct you to the sigmech.store website where you can watch the video you're currently watching right now. And on the back of the card, I also provided you with a link in case you don't have a phone to scan the QR code with, which will again also take you to the website in case this video is ever removed from this platform, and so therefore this video will always remain available. Next in the package, you will find two smaller packages, one that contains the parts needed for the FCU modification and the other one that contains the parts for the grip modification. In the FCU kit here, you will find two plates, and these will be the templates that you're going to use that match the factory cutout specs. And you will also find a combination of screws and corresponding nuts, as well as two Allen keys, one for each screw size in the bag. Now, in the grip module kit, you'll find two plates, a pair of screws and nuts, as well as a single Allen key to match the screw heads inside the bag. The last thing in the MSAFE-T kit package is a plastic container, and this contains 2 cutting bits, one being a carbide steel cutter and the other one a tungsten bit. And so what you see here is almost everything you need to complete the modification, and I did try to include as much as I could in this kit so as to make this as convenient and easy as possible to do all the work. However, there are some tools you will need to supply in order to do this project, and so now we'll take a look at those. For this project, you will need a Dremel or other handheld rotary tool that can accept 3mm shank Dremel bits. And this is important because the bits included in the MSAFE-T kit are 3mm diameter shanks. And as far as hand tools go, I also recommend having a small flat file for finishing and smoothing surfaces after you've made your cuts. Next, if you want to follow the Sig Sauer Armorer's manual instructions, you should have a new sear housing roll pin for this project. Since you will be completely dismantling the FCU to the bare frame, Sig does recommend armorers use a new roll pin when reassembling the FCU. However, as a side note, I have reused my roll pin several times without any issues, but I want to mention this in case you want to closely follow the Sig specs for installation. Now, if you are planning on using a new roll pin, make sure to save the old roll pin because we're going to use it in the process of installation for the FCU template. Speaking of factory parts, I of course recommend you have a factory manual safety lever assembly for when you complete the project. Some optional materials you may want to have on hand is a fine tip Sharpie, some masking tape, an armorer's block, a cleaning cloth, a magnet to catch shavings, and possibly a vise if you feel that might be necessary. Last, and I know this goes without saying within the firearms community since safety always comes first, but make sure you have your personal protective equipment when working. This project requires safety glasses, but I would also highly recommend a long sleeve shirt because when cutting the metal FCU frame, you will create these very fine slivers and you don't want those going to your arms or inside your eyes. And I also would not recommend wearing gloves when working with rotary tools. They might get caught in the tool as you're working. Okay, so that's it for the tools you need. Let's install the MSAFE-T FCU template first. To start the installation, you will need to have a completely stripped FCU like this one here. And if you haven't already done this step, I'm going to post a link to the Sig Mechanics video that will show you the step-by-step disassembly and later reassembly of the FCU. Once you have a completely stripped FCU, make sure you don't have any debris or oil on the body. So wipe down the frame with a cloth and specifically focus on the cutting area, both front and back, so here and over here, and make sure to also clean the through holes on that side of the FCU. Next, we're going to take our MSAFE-T kit and find the package with the FCU cutout template, which looks like this one here. And just make sure you have all the parts inside. So you should have 2 plates, one larger screw and nut and one smaller screw and nut, and 2 Allen keys. Now, to install this kit, I have found a method that I recommend you do because it makes your life easier when working with these small screws and nuts. Because the initial instinct is probably to install the screws so that the heads are facing you. However, when I was testing, I found that by installing the screws from the back, you actually get better leverage and faster results. So I'm going to show you that method now. Start with the rear plate, and this is the part that looks like this one. And note that the bottom has a sort of hook at the back here. And this part gets installed to the inner face of the FCU back here. And then 2 screws will be inserted to hold this plate in place. Now, the easiest way to do this is to pre-insert the 2 screws through the rear of this plate like this. And you might notice that the screws only fit one way, so one screw is larger than the other, and this was done to make sure you get the tightest possible grip when you're cutting later on. Once you've placed the screws, take this setup here and at a slight angle, start to slide the rear plate into the inside edge of the FCU. And I find that by using the FCU frame itself, you can actually lightly push up the screws about 1 millimeter or 2, and that way you can slide the assembly in a little bit easier. The goal here is to line up the FCU through holes to the screws so that the plate just drops into place like this. Next, take the corresponding Allen keys and insert the keys from the opposite side of the FCU. You will want to use the Allen keys to hold the screws in place for the next few steps. Now, while supporting the Allen keys with your hands, take the front plate and line it up to the screws and just drop it in place. And now you want to take the first nut, and I usually start with the larger one, and start threading it into the first screw like this, and turn it down so that the nut touches the front faceplate. But you don't need to tighten this nut right now. Now you can remove the first Allen key, but hold on to the second one and take the second nut, the smaller one, and begin to thread it down. Now, if you notice that the two nuts, when you thread it all the way down, are hitting each other or one's resting on top of the other, don't worry, this is actually a feature that I will explain later. But for now, you want to make it so that the two nuts are sitting flat on the template. So if you do run into this problem, just adjust the other nut so that you can create the clearance you need, after which just use the Allen key to turn the screw until the nuts are both flush with the plate. Again, you don't have to tighten the plates right now, just enough so that the plates are secure but also remain a little bit loose. So you should be able to have a little bit of play when you move the templates manually. And the reason we're doing this is because if you crank down the screws right now, the hook at the back of the rear plate is going to want to drop down a bit with the rotation of those nuts, which we don't want to do right now because this template was designed to assure that the cutout window is precisely where it should be located on the factory model. So to assure that this is the case, the templates are using a 3-point contact system. The first 2 points obviously being the 2 screws, and the third point being this hole at the back where you will now install the old factory roll pin we saved from earlier on when you disassembled your FCU. Now, this next part is important to prevent damage to the template. When you begin installing the roll pin, make sure that the rear plate of the template is moved out of the way and upwards so that the roll pin doesn't hit it. Because if this plate shifts down in front of the roll pin while you're tapping it down, it is possible to bend the rear plate. So just push up on it a little bit until the roll pin clears both the plates, and then just tap the roll pin all the way through to the other side. Once that's completed, you can now take your Allen keys and begin to tighten the screws down. And while doing this, just check to make sure that the rear hook at the back of the rear plate connects and remains tight to the roll pin as you tighten it. And just a note, you want this tight enough so that it doesn't move around when you're manipulating the plates, but you don't need to crank it down so tight that you'll have trouble removing the screws later, or that the Allen keys might strip the screw heads. And I'm just going to point out that the nuts are specifically made so that there's just enough clearance between them that they sit flat on the front plate, but also when you're turning the Allen keys, the nuts will rotate and bind to one another, which as you will see provides great leverage and does help self-tighten these screws further. So generally speaking, you won't need a small wrench for this setup to hold the nuts in place, as you should be able to do this part with just the Allen keys. And as a note, the nuts should thread in and out smoothly, so if you're having trouble, back out the nut first and then try again, just so you don't strip the threads. Okay, so here you have it. The plates are now installed and the FCU is ready for cutting. So now we're going to move on to the install process for the grip module kit. But if you want to skip right to the cutting of the FCU, select the chapter in the video description below, or just jump to the timestamp on the screen here. Moving on to the installation for the grip module. This installation is fairly straightforward. However, I want to share some methods to the installation that I found make for a better experience. To begin with, we're going to take the MSAFE-T kit and find the package with the grip module cutout templates, which looks like this one here. And just make sure you have all the parts inside. So you should have 2 plates, a pair of screws and nuts, and a single Allen key. Now, you may notice that when you look at the plates inside, there is one template that is made so that it has a small return at the end here. This is what I call the key. And that key is the part that when the template is installed onto the grip module here, this will rest tightly into the slide lock lever's notch. And therefore, when it's in place, this assembly locates the exact positioning for where you need to cut out the grip to allow the arms of the manual safety lever to protrude out the sides of the firearm. Now, as most of you know, most grip modules these days, when you look closely at this area back here and under the right lighting conditions, you can see that the grip has a visible mold mark right from the factory. So it's almost like Sig Sauer is providing you with a secondary reference template you can use to confirm you're cutting in the right spot. And it's actually pretty common right now for people to cut this notch out by just simply and carefully tracing out the mold markings. And that is absolutely possible, but most people don't want to accidentally ruin their grip because, as you will see later on, it is possible that if the grip is not protected while you're cutting, the cutting bit can begin to jump or chatter, and which could ruin the cut or blemish the grip module itself. Now, I do want to reiterate that this template is made specifically for the X series module, and that's the one that looks like this one here. And it does also work for the X10 model. I have tried it, but the MSAFE-T kit is not currently designed for the standard P320 grip module, mainly due to this piece of plastic here on the standard grips that prevents the template from resting flat on the cutting surface. But I will have a template soon for those subscribers who want to convert the standard grip module. So stay tuned for that. All right, to install the X series grip module template, you want to start by assembling the template first, and that's done by simply lining up the two plates so that the key in the middle causes the plates to be separated at the center, and you can also see the curvature at the bottom of the plates flare outwards from the center, and this is so that it can rest on the radius molded into the X series grip module here. Now, once you line up the plates, you can then insert both your screws, and thread the nut on the other side on both of them. At this point, we don't have to tighten them, we're just turning them in a bit so the plates hold together. By the way, you can install the screws on either side of the template. It was designed with a height clearance enough at the top to let you adjust the screws with the Allen key once the template is inserted on top of the grip. All right, so the next step I highly recommend doing and not skipping. This template is made to be manually held down while you work with your fingers. So even when the screws are tightened, it still slips off if you release pressure. And this is done on purpose so that you don't accidentally crack or split your grip by over tightening the screws. Essentially, the distance I left at the center gap here is just enough to touch the grip, but not bind the grip surface. However, if you want to get a better grip, a good tip is to take some masking tape and cut off a small strip, no more than the distance between the slide release and the cutout, where the cutout will go. And place the small strip along the edge of the grip module like this. Now, when you install the template onto the grip, you will get a tighter hold. But by the way, if the template doesn't fit at first, loosen up the screws, just do a quarter turn and try again. Just be aware that the screws are just long enough to clear the plates on the other side. So don't overturn the screw or you might risk dropping the nuts. Okay, so after making sure that the key that we talked about earlier is firmly in place inside the slide catch notch here, we can tighten the screws down. And just when you're done, check to see if it's firmly in place. Just manipulate it with your hands. Now, just a tip, don't get overly confident that the template will hold right here. Although it does feel pretty tight, you still want to maintain manual control as you're cutting. As you will see, I added all the material here on the sides to give you as much surface area for hand placement as I could, but I will go into more detail when we get to the cutting portion of this video. Okay, so the X series grip module plates are installed and we can start making our cuts. Now, I'm going to start with the FCU cutout, but if you want to skip right to the grip cutting, select the correct chapter in the video description below or just jump to the timestamp on the screen here. Okay, so the template is mounted to the FCU and we can now start cutting the manual safety cutout design into the FCU. To begin, we're going to take our MSAFE-T kit and find the plastic container with 2 cutting bits inside. And just a quick note, this one is the carbide bit and this one is the tungsten bit. And you can tell the difference as the tungsten one has been further hardened at the tip and it has this flamed finish at the cutting end. Now, a quick warning about these bits: the way that metal cutting works is a harder metal can cut into a softer metal, and the harder the cutting bit, the easier it will be to cut into the softer metal. So what I've done with the MSAFE-T kit is provide you with a carbon bit that is strong enough to cut the FCU material, but also soft enough to provide you a slight amount of contact time with the template itself, meaning that light touches on the template with the cutting bit for short periods of time won't cut into the template. At most, you may have some scratches, but as you can see, I also polished and chrome plated the template, so it's harder to nick the surface of the template as you work. Therefore, by the time you're done cutting, the template should remain in almost new condition, which is why you should be able to modify multiple FCUs with just one kit. Now, that being said, if you end up putting too much pressure for too long, the bit will cut into the template. So even though the template is manufactured out of hardened stainless steel with the additional chrome plating I mentioned earlier for additional hardness, you cannot approach this project with a heavy hand. A light approach is needed, and we're going to talk about good technique later on. Now, the tungsten bit is much harder than the carbide bit, and therefore will be able to cut into the FCU material easier and faster, but it can also cut the template easier. So be aware that although you can use the tungsten bit, it will provide you with less contact time with the template and therefore less room for error. So I strongly recommend you start with the carbide bit first and use the tungsten one only if you feel confident in your ability to control the tool. However, seeing as how this cutting process may intimidate some people, I want to clarify what may happen if something goes wrong. And to do that, I want to reference the M18 P320 for a minute and show you something interesting that may help you if you're worried about the work you're about to do, especially if you're concerned about precision. So as you can see, the MSAFE-T kit here is very accurate to the factory spec. And as you can see, when we overlay the template to the factory FCU cutout, it matches the cutout exactly. But I also want to point out that you do have some degree of forgiveness and tolerance when working, because even though the MSAFE-T template keeps you within these factory specs, if you were to make the cutout slightly smaller or bigger, but still keep the overall cutout design, the safety lever assembly will still work. For example, here is an image of the template mounted to the JSD 80% frame. And as you can see, the top layer is the factory specs and the bottom is the JSD frame, which is sold with the cutout already in place when you buy it. And although the JSD design is still fully usable and functional with the factory manual safety when it's installed, it's clearly noticeable that the cutout is nowhere near factory specification. So as you can see, being a little off spec is totally fine. Now, of course, if while you're working you apply so much pressure to the cutting tool that you begin to cut the template itself, or if you angle your cuts too steeply with the cutting bit that again you cut the template and consequently manage to destroy the cutout design to the point that it becomes unusable, I still have some relatively good news, which is that the cutout plays absolutely no role in the normal safety or operation of the P320, other than for using and installing the manual safety lever, which means that even if you manage to cut the FCU to the point that you can no longer install the factory manual safety lever, just know that you can always keep using the firearm as a non-manual safety version. So silver lining, not all is lost if you fail to trace the cutout altogether. However, if you feel that this is above your capabilities, remember that a certified gunsmith is always the way to go. Okay, let's get into the cutting. So if you follow the early instructions, your FCU still looks like this one here, and we're going to check first to make sure the plates are firmly in place. And to do that, just we're going to do a simple manual manipulation here, but if they do move, tighten the screws and just test it again. If that is tight, we can do an optional step, which is to take a marker and trace the cutout onto the FCU frame, which can help you later on when you're checking your work. And this really helps when doing your final finishing touches, because you can see if you missed a pass with the cutting bit or where a touch-up may be needed with a file. Oh, and if you're wondering why your FCU doesn't look like this one here, just be aware that there are two variations of the FCU. One that has this pre-cut through hole through the side, and one with no through hole at all, which is pre-upgrade. If you have a pre-upgrade version, you will need to start cutting by making a pilot hole into the center of the frame to get you started. To do that, you will just hold the cutting bit at a 45-degree angle and apply light pressure downward to cut away some material. Now, if you have the through hole, I prefer to start making the cuts from there just because it's a little bit easier. Okay, last notes before we physically cut the FCU. First, when cutting, take your time. Do not apply any pressure on the cutting tool unless you get a feel for how the tool will react. And I've done quite a few FCUs and therefore I have some experience, of course. And the best advice I can give you before you start is to let the bit do the cutting on its own. Your job is to simply maintain control of the bit and guide it, but let the cutting bit kind of cut down using its own weight. Second thing is to make small passes and movements without downward pressure because even if it looks like you may not be cutting, your tool is still removing material if it's contacting the FCU frame. Third, I want to let you know that especially when you're tracing the outer edges of this template, by inserting the cutting bit a bit further into the template, you can get the non-cutting edge of the bit here to sort of rest on the template face. So it acts similar to a routing tool, which does make it easier to control as you're working. But again, you want to avoid prolonged touching of the cutting teeth on the template. And also when you're working on the outer edges, make sure you're continuously stopping to check your work as you go, just to make sure you're not accidentally cutting into the template. It's always better to have to file down the last bit if you're not sure you can get it with the cutting tool. Fourth, and this is important, make sure to keep the cutting bit level the entire time that you cut. You want to go straight through the FCU and not at an angle. So keep this in mind as you work because it's easy to end up focusing on what's happening in the front plates and forget that the rear plate is also there to help guide you. And now last, and this ties into what I just said, the absolute most important part of the cutout are these two notches right here. Keep in mind that the safety lever's detent rides along this wall here and pops in and out of these two notches. So if you can get this particular area to be nice and smooth and relatively close to the template design, you will be successful. All right, so let's get into the cutting. Set your Dremel tool to at least 10,000 RPM, but you can work at whatever speed you like. I probably wouldn't exceed 20,000 RPM though. And what I think I'm going to do is film the full process, but I'll refrain from commenting as I work since I'm not sure if the microphone will capture my voice clearly as I'm cutting. But if I think it's necessary, I'll go back and I'll voice over any parts that might be helpful or make comments on the screen as I work. Okay, let's begin. Okay, so I feel like I've gotten the cutout relatively to where I want it, so now I'm going to remove the template and inspect my work and make any final changes or fine-tuning I might need, which may mean that I'll be filing down the surfaces a bit or perhaps reinstalling the template to make further cuts. And in my case here, once I remove the template, if everything looks good, I will then progress into doing a test fit and function of the manual safety levers before I rebuild the FCU. Alright, so now it's time to do a test fit of the factory manual safety lever, and the good news is you don't need to put the entire FCU back together for this. We can instead simulate this with a few parts on the bare FCU. And to do that, we can simply take the detent spring and insert this into the left lever, followed by the detent itself. And now put this aside for a second as we take the sear pivot pin and insert it into the FCU. Just don't put it in all the way. Now we can take the right side lever and insert this into the FCU. And as you can see, the sear pivot pin sort of butts up against it for now. And last, we take the left lever and insert the lever into the pin coming out of the side of the FCU here. And now we just rotate the two levers so that you can feel the positive connection between the two parts. Now simply just rotate the two levers further until the detent here falls into the new cutout. And you can see here that the lever is inserted at the bottommost part of the cut before we lift the levers, and the detent will now click in place. And last, do a slight rotation of the levers to create a little gap here at the top so that you can now push in the sear pivot pin all the way through so that the end of the pin rests in between the left lever over here. And now you can proceed to test the assembly normally. Now, if you notice that the manual safety is very rough or super stiff when you try to activate or deactivate it, you can take the assembly out and do another pass of the cutting bit or file in order to, again, smooth out the surface on which the detent rides on. Just remember that the file is an excellent way to control your cuts, and with a flat file, you can get a nice flat surface here and here. And keep in mind that these two areas need to be as flat as possible, and this peak up here should remain as sharp as you can make it to get a nice final finish. If your manual safety lever assembly operates smoothly after testing, it's time to reassemble the FCU. Now, in order not to make this video too long by showing you how to reassemble the FCU from scratch with the manual safety lever, I'm going to instead recommend that you watch the Sig Mechanics video called P320 FCU, a textbook teardown, in which I do provide a complete step-by-step reassembly instruction of the basic non-manual safety FCU. And so when you're watching that video, just keep in mind that you only need to reassemble the FCU to the point just before installing the trigger and trigger bar, so it should look like this one here. The added benefit of starting from this assembly here instead of trying to install the manual safety levers from scratch is that you'll basically only need to swap out the safety lever pivot pin because if you opt to try to reassemble it from the beginning, you will need to fumble with offsetting the takedown lever bar, and it could be frustrating to do it that way. So this method is actually simpler and it's a better process. So if you are ready to reassemble the FCU, jump over to that video and then come back here when you're done. Or if you've already finished reassembly of the FCU, keep watching as I will now show you how to install the manual safety levers to your build. However, if you want to get into the preparation and cutting of the grip, skip to the timestamp on the screen here or select that chapter in the video description below. To start, you will first prep the manual safety assembly by inserting the detent spring into the right lever here, and then follow that up with the detent itself. And just be careful not to compress the spring right now to prevent accidentally making your detent fly across the room. So just prep these parts and set them aside for just a minute. In the next step, we're going to take the safety lever pivot pin out of the FCU, and when we do that, we will replace it with this pin here that is from the manual safety lever assembly. The first step here is to get the takedown safety lever bar to move out of our way. And a nice hack here is to install the takedown lever as you normally would if the FCU was in the grip module. So take the takedown lever and make note of this small little slot over here. And this slot is where the sloped edge of the takedown lever bar sits into. Keeping that in mind, install the takedown lever through the through holes, and now just line up the slot that I just mentioned to the sloped edge of the takedown lever bar. And now you can rotate the takedown, and the takedown safety lever bar will now be forced to the rear. This not only frees up the safety lever pivot pin, but also the sear pivot pin is exposed, and we need this for a future step. Now back to removing the safety lever pivot pin, and the best way I like doing this is to hold the FCU so that when the pin is removed, all the internals of the sear housing will remain lined up so that you can essentially just insert the manual safety lever pin from the opposite side. However, if you need to, you can always insert a pin punch through the opposite side of the FCU and then proceed to insert the manual safety lever the same way. Both options work just fine. It just depends on your level of comfort with the FCU. Now we can just put the FCU in its upright position and we can focus on installing the other lever. First, rotate the left lever so that the wings are facing towards the muzzle end, and then flip to the other side where we will install the right lever. Now we just need to push in the sear pivot pin, and that's this pin right here that's sticking out of the FCU, and we just need this pin to be flush with the FCU frame. So we don't need to push it out, we just need to move it out of the way for a second. And to do that, I'll use a pin punch to go ahead and push that pin inwards a little so that it ends up flush. With that done, we can now focus on installing the right lever. And here I want you to make note that to install the manual safety lever, the detent, this part here, needs to have this small chevron shaped pin here start at the lowest point of the manual safety cutout. So when we install the right lever, we will place it so that the chevron is in that direction, just like you did when you did your test fit earlier on. Now with the detent lined up, we will just connect the two levers together, and I'm just going to carefully compress the detent with my fingers a bit to allow the detent to drop into that cutout. When you know it's in, we're going to rotate the manual safety levers downwards a little until we get a positive tactile feedback from the manual safety clicking into place. Now we can just push the sear pivot pin back all the way through the FCU, and we're just going to do another function check. And once we know the manual safety fits well, we can release the takedown lever and pull it out of the FCU and try for another function check. Okay, so the manual safety is now installed and working, so let's put back the trigger and trigger bar. Before reassembly of the trigger bar, however, note that you will not be using the standard trigger bar anymore. You'll now be installing the trigger bar that has the manual safety cut at the back, like this one here. First, insert the offset pin of the trigger bar spring into the trigger bar like this. And next, take the hook of the spring and insert it into the back of the FCU. Following that, we will take the trigger bar and place the rear arm so it sits on the sear housing, and then we're going to rotate it so that the neck of the trigger bar is forwards facing. Now we will take the trigger, and while manipulating the rear side of the trigger bar, we will align the trigger shoe pin to the trigger bar so that it drops into place. Now we simply just pull the trigger and force the rear of the trigger bar to drop into the housing. Okay, so let's start cutting the manual safety cutout design into the X series grip. So if you follow the earlier instructions, your grip module will look like this one here. And like I mentioned before, the grip template is not made to have a super firm grip on the polymer frame. So you will be required to manually hold the template in place as you cut. If you install the masking tape first, I remind you that although it provides a bit of additional grip, it can still move a bit, so hold down the template as you work. Before you start, note that the polymer is soft and the carbide bit is going to easily cut into it. But it's entirely possible that the cutting bit might jump or move a bit unexpectedly, which is not really a problem if you're taking your time and you don't rush this. For those that might be a bit nervous, just be aware that this modification is a fairly common one amongst the P320 community. It's simple and it just takes some time and a steady hand. Also, there is a bit of tolerance here because when the manual safety lever is installed, the wings of the safety lever generally hide any mistakes that you might have made. But again, take your time and let the bit do the work. Don't force it. You're going to want to start at the top right side of the template. As you can see, I added a bit of a gap in the template to allow a little bit easier access here, and make your first pilot hole. Now remember that the cutting bit is not a drill, so you can't cut straight down, only at the sides where the teeth are. So you may need to angle the bit a little to make the first cut. And once you're in, you could try to do the rough cut and then just try to remove the most amount of material from the center without really focusing on tracing around the edges yet. Once you finish the rough cuts, you can now start to trace along the edges of the template. And you're still going to want to keep the bit flat here to make sure you get a nice smooth finish. But remember that you can use a small file for any finishing touches. Another helpful method I found for when you're finishing up the grip cut and you're trying to deburr these small plastic pieces that might be left over is to take the other cutting bit that came with the MSAFE-T kit, and while it's still in the plastic holder, use this as a deburring tool, and you can just rotate the cutter along the cutout, and the teeth of the cutter will do a great job at grinding out the final pieces. Before we move on, I also want to talk about any potential issues that you might run into when working on the grip modules, and also let you know how to resolve those issues if you run into them. Because during testing, I did find that some grip modules, once you complete the cutout with the template, the FCU will simply drop right in. And if that's the case for you, feel free to move on to the next step. However, in other modules, once the cutout was made, the grip needed additional minor fitting in order to make the FCU seat properly. Therefore, during testing, I began to take measurements of various grips and found that somewhere along the line, there may have been a change to the grip module dimensions that no one would really have noticed, since these changes are not really announced. A good example of this would be how Sig Sauer got rid of these small fins at the back of grips because they kept breaking off. However, the minor variation is not really a problem, and it's easy enough to work around it. So next, I'm going to tell you how to identify if your grip needs further modification and how to correct the issue if you come across it. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, when you install the grip template, you will notice that no matter what grip you have, the cutout design of the template will match the molded markings on the grip. And so since the molded markings are still the same on all the grips, this is a good indicator that the molded ledge here on some grips may have a variance of about 0.04 inches. So what you will find is that after cutting the grip using the grip template, you will then try to reinsert the FCU to test for function, and then realize that the FCU does not want to seat all the way down. And if you look at the takedown lever through hole here, you can see that the FCU will keep rising up a small amount every time I try to push it down. And what's happening here is that the grip cutout is not yet low enough to let the wings of the lever sit far enough down for the FCU to align inside the grip. Therefore, it will be necessary to do a bit of finishing work there, so to adjust for that difference. Now, when I remove the FCU for a second and move your attention over to the cutout here, you can see that when we forced the FCU down, the wings of the lever imprinted a marking on the grip. And that marking is the depth to which we need to cut the grip down in order to have the levers freely operate when the FCU is seated correctly. And if you measure that marking, you get about 0.04 inches, like I mentioned previously. Now, to correct for that dimensional variance, start by reinserting your FCU, and while holding it down, try to actuate the manual safety lever in order to clearly mark the plastic over here. Then remove the FCU and prepare to make your finishing cuts. Now, keep in mind that this process will need to be done freehanded, so just like before, take your time and keep the cutting bit level as you cut. Also, when cutting, set the Dremel to a low speed, and mine is set to 5,000 RPM, which is the lowest setting I have. And having the speed set so low means that you'll be able to maintain excellent control over the cutter as you work. And finally, make note that you do not need to widen the cutout on the sides here because they're already at the correct dimension. So you only need to slowly cut downwards towards the marking while maintaining the radius at the base we already have. Also, it does help that as you're making the finishing cut, once you reach the markings you made in the plastic, take the FCU and reinsert it and actuate the manual safety levers. And so if you can still mark the plastic, it means that you need to keep going a bit further. But if you actuate the levers and you find that you cannot mark the plastic anymore and the manual safety actuates freely, it means that you've completed the cuts and you can now move on to the next step. Okay, so we have completed all the cuts for the grip module, and the FCU is also cut and reassembled. So it's time to do a final reconstruction of the P320 and do a complete function check. Okay, so the P320 is rebuilt with the newly installed manual safety lever. So let's check that everything works well. So with the safety disengaged, the striker is released. And now with the safety engaged, the trigger is not going back and the P320 is now rendered safe. Okay, so I hope this video was helpful. For those of you who are interested in picking up one of these kits, a reminder that you can get it at www.sigmech.store. And for those of you who may want to pick up all the other factory parts and components needed for completing this project, here's a list of all the parts you might need in order to do so, which of course you can pick up at your favorite Sig Sauer authorized dealer. If you're watching this video because you already got the MSAFE-T kit, I just want to sincerely thank you for supporting Sig Mechanics, and I hope to be able to continue to provide you with more educational videos and reviews, as well as continue to launch cool new projects in the future that I hope will be as useful as this one here. Okay, that's all I have for you today. See you soon.